Let us begin together, right here in this moment. Wherever you are, allow the outside world to fade away. Join me and take a long, slow, deep breath in, filling your lungs from the very bottom to the top, feeling your chest and belly expand with calming, life-giving air. And now, release it all with a gentle, audible sigh. Feel the tension melt from your shoulders, your jaw, your brow. Let it all dissolve. As you find a position of comfort, I invite you to bring your awareness to your own corner of the world. What city or town are you in? What time does your clock show? Is the moon a bright sliver in your night sky, or is the sun just beginning to hint at its morning arrival? We connect in this moment, a global community seeking stillness together. If you feel comfortable, allow your eyelids to grow heavy and gently drift closed. Let my voice be your guide as we journey back, not to a distant forest or a great kingdom, but into the very inner circle of the man who would become the Buddha. This is the story of Channa. Before there was a Buddha, there was a prince named Siddhartha, and wherever the prince went, Channa was there. He was not merely a servant, he was the prince's royal charioteer, his childhood companion, and his most loyal confidant. He was born on the same day as the prince, and their lives were woven together from the very start. Channa's identity was not his own, it was defined by his proximity to greatness. His pride was immense, but it was a reflected pride. He was the one who knew the prince's habits, who could anticipate his moods, who drove the magnificent chariot drawn by the noble white horse, Kantaka. To serve the prince was his life's entire purpose, and he performed his duties with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He lived within the gilded cage of the palace, a world meticulously crafted by the king to shield his son from any hint of suffering. For Channa, this was not a cage, but a perfect, orderly universe. His job was to maintain that perfection, to ensure the prince's path was always smooth, beautiful, and free of unpleasantness. He was the guardian of the prince's perfect world. But no wall, however high, can keep out the truths of human existence. The day came when the prince, filled with a divine curiosity, wished to see the world beyond the palace gates. Channa, with a heart full of pride, prepared the grandest chariot. He would show his prince the beautiful city, the happy subjects, the perfection that the kingdom had to offer. But the gods, it is said, had other plans. On their first trip, they encountered an old man, his body bent and frail, his skin wrinkled like a dried fruit, leaning heavily on a staff. Prince Siddhartha, who had never witnessed such advanced age, was deeply shaken. "What is that, Channa?" he asked, his voice filled with a strange wonder. "And will I too become like that?" Channa's heart sank. This was a flaw in the perfect world, a sight from which he was supposed to shield his master. "That is an old man, my prince," he replied, reluctantly. "It is the way of all life.
We are all born to grow old." Channa's instinct was to turn the chariot away, to race back to the familiar comfort of the palace, but the prince insisted they continue. On their next trip, they saw a sick man lying by the side of the road, his body covered in sores, groaning in agony. Again, the prince was struck to his core. "And what is that, Channa? Can this happen to me, to my family, to everyone?" Channa's discomfort grew. "That is sickness, my prince," he explained, his voice low. "It is a fate that can befall any of us, at any time." On their third trip, they encountered a funeral procession. A body lay stiff and lifeless on a bier, being carried to the cremation ground, followed by weeping, grief-stricken relatives. The prince stared, his face pale. He had never before comprehended the finality of death. "Channa," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "what is that? And will I also die and be carried away like that?" Channa felt a cold dread. This was the ultimate failure. He had allowed his prince to witness the three great sorrows of life, the very truths the king had tried so desperately to hide. "That is a dead man, my prince," Channa said, his own heart heavy with sorrow. "It is the inescapable end for all who are born." These sights planted a seed of profound disquiet in the prince's heart. But for Channa, they were simply unpleasant realities, unfortunate cracks in the beautiful facade he was trying to maintain. He did not feel the prince's existential shock. He felt only a professional failure. He did not see the universal truth of suffering. He saw only a series of unfortunate events that had disturbed his master. The fourth sight was different. They saw an ascetic, a wandering holy man with a shaved head and a simple robe, his face radiating a deep and powerful peace. He had nothing, yet he seemed to possess everything. The prince saw in this man not a problem, but a solution. He saw a path out of the inescapable prison of old age, sickness, and death. For Channa, however, the man was just a beggar, a man who had foolishly renounced the comforts and glories of the world, comforts that Channa himself cherished. He could not understand the prince's fascination. The seed that had been planted in the prince's heart began to sprout. The gilded cage had become a prison of suffering, and he knew he had to escape. One night, in the velvet darkness when the entire palace was deep in slumber, the prince came to Channa's chambers. He was dressed not in his royal silks, but in simple clothes for travel. His face was set with a quiet, unshakable resolve. He told Channa to saddle Kantaka, the white horse. They were leaving. Channa was horrified. He begged the prince to reconsider, to leave the palace, his beautiful wife, his newborn son, his aging father, his destiny as a great king. It was madness. His loyalty compelled him to obey, but his heart screamed in protest. He did not understand. Why would anyone willingly leave perfection to wander the world as a beggar? Reluctantly, tearfully, he did as he was commanded. The three of them, the prince, the charioteer, and the horse, stole through the silent city like ghosts. They rode all night, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life they were leaving behind. They finally stopped at dawn on the banks of the river Anoma. Here the prince performed the acts of his great renunciation. He took off his royal ornaments, the jewels and silks that were the symbols of his status, and handed them to Channa. "Take these back to my father," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Tell him not to grieve. I have not left out of anger or ambition, but in search of an end to suffering for all beings." Then the prince took his sword, and with one swift motion, he cut off his long, blue-black hair, the mark of a warrior prince, and let it fall to the ground. Channa watched, his heart breaking. The man before him was no longer his prince. He was a stranger, a homeless ascetic. Kantaka, the horse, it is said, was so overcome with grief at his master's departure that his own heart broke, and he died there on the riverbank. Channa knelt in the dust, clutching the jewels and the shorn hair, and wept with an inconsolable sorrow. He had lost everything: his master, his purpose, his very identity. The world as Channa knew it had ended on the bank of that river. He was no longer the proud charioteer to a great prince. He was the bearer of relics, the messenger of a great loss. This was the end of his first life and the beginning of a long, difficult journey towards an understanding he could not yet begin to imagine.
Channa's return journey to the palace was a slow, agonizing funeral procession for a world that had died. The magnificent chariot, which had once felt like an extension of his own proud heart, now seemed a hollow, mocking shell. The space where the prince had sat was a gaping void, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the mournful creak of the wheels and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He imagined he could still feel the phantom weight of Kantaka in the harness, still hear the proud snort of the great white horse, and each imagined sound was a fresh stab of pain. He clutched the bag containing the prince's jewels and his shorn hair to his chest, as if it were a fragile, wounded bird. These were the last remnants of his master, the last tangible proof of the life that was now gone forever. He did not rush. Part of him wanted to delay the inevitable, to put off the moment when he would have to face the king and deliver his message of desolation. Let yourself feel that feeling of reluctance, of wanting to postpone a difficult moment. Acknowledge it, and then, with a gentle breath, let it go, just as Channa had to let the miles pass beneath his chariot's wheels. When he finally reached the gates of Kapilavastu, the guards who had hailed his departure with proud salutes now stared at him with wide, questioning eyes. The lone charioteer, the empty chariot, the image told a story of disaster before a single word was spoken. A hush fell over the palace courtyard as he entered. Servants and courtiers stopped what they were doing, their faces turning towards him, a sea of confusion and dawning horror. He walked through the familiar halls, which now felt alien and cold, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He was led directly to the king's private chamber. King Suddhodana, his face etched with the anxiety of a sleepless night, rose as Channa entered. He looked past Channa, his eyes searching the space behind him for the familiar, beloved figure of his son. When he saw no one, his face, which had been alight with a desperate hope, began to crumble. "Channa," the king's voice was a strained whisper. "Where is he? Where is my son?" Channa could not speak. He knelt, his body trembling, and laid the cloth bag at the king's feet. With shaking hands he opened it. The royal jewels, which had once sparkled with the light of the sun, now seemed dull and lifeless, and beside them the lustrous coil of blue-black hair lay like a dead serpent. A terrible guttural cry was torn from the king's throat, the sound of a father's heart breaking. He collapsed back into his throne, picking up the hair, running up through his fingers as if his touch could somehow restore the life that had been so willfully cast aside. The news spread through the palace like a poison. Siddhartha's wife, the graceful Princess Yasodhara, received the news not with loud wails, but with a deep, silent, and profound grief that seemed to still the very air around her. She retired to her chambers and removed all her own jewelry, her fine silks, and chose to live a simple, ascetic life within the palace walls, a quiet solidarity with the husband she had lost to a quest she could not comprehend. Channa's role in the palace was now a strange and painful one. He was no longer the proud charioteer. He was a living ghost, a walking monument to the palace's greatest sorrow. He was treated with a kind of sorrowful respect. The king would often summon him, not to give orders, but to ask him to recount, for the 100th time, the story of the departure, every detail of the prince's last words, the expression on his face.
And Channa would oblige, his own grief a raw wound that could never heal, because he was constantly forced to reopen it. His pride, however, refused to die. In his heart, he could not accept that his prince was a common beggar. He told himself this was just a phase, a temporary spiritual trial. His master was a king, destined for greatness, and this path would surely lead him to an even greater throne. He clung to the past with a desperate tenacity. He would spend long hours in the royal stables, polishing the now unused chariot until it gleamed, a ritual of denial. He would talk endlessly to the other servants about the old days, about the prince's skill with the bow, his grace in the royal court, his glorious presence. He refused to use the name Siddhartha when he spoke of him. He was always my prince, my master. The 6 years that Siddhartha spent in his relentless search for enlightenment were, for Channa, 6 years of waiting. He was a man frozen in time, waiting for the world to return to its proper order, for his prince to come to his senses and return home to claim his kingdom. Then, one day, messengers brought astonishing news. The homeless ascetic Siddhartha had, after years of struggle, achieved supreme enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He was no longer a prince, no longer just a man. He was the Buddha, the awakened one. The news was met with confusion and awe throughout the kingdom, but Channa heard it differently. He did not hear the spiritual significance. He heard only victory. His pride swelled in his chest. Of course, his master had succeeded. Just as he was the greatest of princes, he was now the greatest of holy men. It was only natural. It was his destiny. My prince, he would say to anyone who would listen, has become a king of all ascetics. There is no one greater. He interpreted the enlightenment not as a transcendence of self, but as the ultimate personal achievement, another jewel in the prince's crown. He did not understand that the prince he had known was gone forever, dissolved into something infinitely vaster and more profound. The old king, Suddhodana, now frail and nearing the end of his life, longed to see his son one last time. He sent delegation after delegation to the Buddha, nobles and ministers bearing rich gifts, pleading with him to return to his home city. But a strange thing happened. Each delegation would listen to the Buddha's teachings and, so moved by his wisdom, they would renounce their worldly lives and join his order of monks, never returning with a reply. The king grew desperate. Finally, he decided to send one last messenger, a childhood friend of Siddhartha's named Kaludai. But in Channa's mind, a single thought burned. If anyone could persuade the master, it was he. He, Channa, his most loyal, his first and truest disciple. He believed that only he still held the key to the prince's heart. He waited, his pride and his lifelong attachment coiled together, for the call he was sure would come, the call to go and bring his prince back home. He did not know that the man who was coming was not the prince he remembered, and that their reunion would not be a triumphant return, but his life's most difficult and humbling lesson.
The call Channa was expecting never came. The king, desperate, placed his final hope in Kaludai, who promised he would return with the Buddha. Kaludai journeyed to the bamboo grove near Rajagaha, where the Buddha was staying, and like all the others before him, he was so profoundly moved by the Dharma that he too asked to be ordained as a monk. However, he did not forget his promise to the king. After spending time absorbing the teachings, he approached the Buddha. He did not speak of a father's grief or a kingdom's longing. Instead, he spoke with the gentle poetry of a friend. He described the beauty of the road to Kapilavastu in the spring, the cool breezes, the blossoming flowers, and the longing of his kinsmen, the Sakyans, to receive his compassionate wisdom. The Buddha, seeing that the time was right and that the hearts of his people were ready to receive the teachings, agreed to make the journey. Back in Kapilavastu, the news of the Buddha's impending return sent a wave of excitement and confusion through the city. Channa was ecstatic. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The master was finally coming home. In his mind, he pictured a grand procession, the entire city turning out to welcome back their triumphant prince who had gone out and conquered the spiritual world. He imagined himself at the forefront, the proud, loyal servant, reunited with the master he had never stopped serving in his heart. He did not prepare a chariot, for he knew the Buddha now walked, but he prepared his own heart for a celebration. The Buddha and his retinue of hundreds of monks, all arhats, fully enlightened beings, finally arrived at the outskirts of the city. The Sakyan nobles, a proud and haughty clan, came out to greet him. Channa was there, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the sea of saffron robes for that one familiar, beloved face. And then he saw him. The man looked like his prince. He had the same graceful walk, the same noble features, but everything else was different. The simple robe, the shaved head, and most of all, the profound, unshakable calm that seemed to create an aura of stillness around him. This was not the restless, curious prince he had known. This was a being of immense, quiet power. A pang of something uncomfortable, something he couldn't name, went through Channa. It was a mixture of awe and a strange kind of loss. The Sakyan elders, full of their own pride, had decided among themselves that while Siddhartha was their prince, many of the monks accompanying him were younger than them. They decided they would bow to the Buddha, but not to the other monks. As the Buddha approached, they bowed low. But as the stream of monks followed, the elders stood stiff and proud, refusing to show respect. The Buddha, seeing their arrogance, knew that words would not be enough to humble them. He rose effortlessly into the air, and from his body emanated the twin miracle, streams of fire and water issuing forth simultaneously. He then created a jeweled walkway in the sky and paced back and forth, delivering a teaching on the impermanence of pride and the futility of worldly status. The proud Sakyan nobles were shattered, their arrogance dissolved in the face of this undeniable spiritual power. They, along with the entire city, prostrated themselves on the ground, not just before the Buddha, but before his entire Sangha, their pride washed away by a torrent of awe and reverence. Channa watched this from the crowd, and his heart swelled with a familiar feeling. Pride. My master, he thought, he is the greatest of all. He has humbled kings and nobles. No one can stand before him. He did not see the lesson about dissolving the ego. He saw only a magnificent display of power, a confirmation of his master's supreme status. His attachment was so strong it acted like a filter, turning even the most profound spiritual teachings into fuel for his own ego. The next day, the entire city prepared a great feast for the Buddha and his monks. But the Buddha did not appear. Instead, at dawn, he took his alms bowl and began to walk, barefoot, from house to house, silently begging for his food. The news spread like wildfire. The king was horrified. His son, a prince of the mighty Shotkin clan, the man who had just performed miracles in the sky, was now walking like a common beggar in his own city, holding out a bowl for scraps. It was an unbearable disgrace. The king rushed out, his royal entourage trailing behind him, and confronted the Buddha on the street. "My son," he cried, his voice full of anguish, "why do you shame me like this? Why do you shame our lineage? I can provide food for you and all of your monks. There is no need for this begging." The Buddha looked at his father, his eyes filled not with defiance, but with a gentle, loving compassion. "Great king," he said, his voice calm, "you belong to a lineage of kings. It is your custom to provide. But I now belong to a different lineage, the lineage of all the Buddhas, past, present, and future, and it is the custom of this lineage to live on the alms we receive with gratitude, allowing all people the opportunity to create merit." Channa, who had followed the king, listened to this exchange, and his mind reeled. He could not understand. Why would his master deliberately refuse the luxury and honor he was due? Why would he identify with beggars instead of with his own royal family? It felt like another rejection, another turning away from the life and the identity that Channa held so dear.
His confusion began to curdle into a simmering resentment. After this, the Buddha and his monks were invited to stay in a park outside the city. Channa, still officially a servant of the palace, found countless excuses to go there. But he did not go to listen to the teachings, he went to serve the Buddha. He would sweep the grounds around the Buddha's hut with a frantic energy. He would arrange and rearrange his robes. He would stand guard, shooing away people he deemed unworthy. He was trying to recreate his old role, to force himself back into the position of the special, indispensable attendant. But his service was not born of humility. It was born of pride. He still called him my prince. He would address him with the old familiar titles. And when he spoke to the other monks, the great arhats like Sariputta and Moggallana, the Buddha's chief disciples, he was filled with contempt. Who are these men, he would think to himself, these Brahmins and merchants? I was there at the beginning. I was with the Master on the night of the great renunciation. I held his hair in my hands. These others, they're newcomers. They do not know him as I do. He would be insolent and dismissive to them. If Sariputta asked him a question, he would reply with a grunt and turn his back. He believed his past association gave him a status higher than any spiritual attainment they might have achieved. The monks, being enlightened beings, felt no anger towards Channa. They felt only compassion for his ignorance and his arrogance. They would report his behavior to the Buddha, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. The Buddha would summon Channa. "Channa," he would say gently, "Sariputta and Moggallana are your noble brothers on this path. They are great and wise beings. You should treat them with respect and humility." Channa would bow his head and agree. "Yes, my prince," he would say. But in his heart, nothing changed. The words went unheard. He was trapped in the prison of his own past, rattling the bars of his memories, unable to see the new reality that stood right in front of him. His loyalty, once his greatest virtue, had become his greatest poison. His pride, once a reflection of his master's glory, was now a thick wall that blocked out the light of the Dharma. He was on a path to becoming the most difficult, the most stubborn, and the most isolated man in the entire community. Years passed. The Buddha's Sangha grew, and his teachings spread throughout the land. King Suddhodana, after hearing the Dharma from his son, attained the fruits of the path and passed away peacefully. Princess Yashodhara, after her son Rahula was ordained, also chose to leave the worldly life and became a leading figure among the nuns. The palace, the world that Channa had clung to so fiercely, was emptying out, its memories fading like old tapestries. With the king's passing, Channa's formal role as a palace servant dissolved. Lost and without a purpose, he did the only thing he could think of. He went to the Buddha and asked to be ordained as a monk. The Buddha, knowing the difficult path that lay ahead for Channa, accepted him into the order out of compassion. Channa shaved his head, donned the saffron robe, and officially became a member of the Sangha. But changing his clothes did not change his heart. He was a monk in appearance, but a royal charioteer in his mind. The old pride and attachment, far from diminishing, now had a new and more toxic arena in which to fester. He still saw himself as special, as part of an exclusive club of two, himself and his prince. He could not bring himself to see the Buddha as the Buddha, a universal teacher for all beings. In his heart, the awakened one was still his master, and he, Channa, was his original, most important follower. This deep-seated pride manifested as a constant, grating arrogance towards his fellow monks. He treated the Sangha not as a circle of spiritual equals, but as a royal court, in which he held a privileged, unassailable rank.
He would walk through the monastery with a haughty air, looking down on the other monks, even the most senior and respected elders. His inner monologue was a constant refrain of his own importance. I was there on the night of the great renunciation. I rode with him. Who are these others? They know nothing of his true royal nature. They only know this beggar monk. When the two chief disciples, the wise Sariputta and the powerful Moggallana, would deliver a discourse on behalf of the Buddha, Channa would sit in the back, his arms crossed, a look of contempt on his face. He would mutter under his breath, "Who are they to teach? I knew the master when he was a prince. Their understanding is shallow." He refused to participate in the daily duties of the monastery alongside the others. If it was his turn to sweep the paths, he would complain that such menial work was beneath him. If it was his turn to fetch water, he would grumble that he was a charioteer, not a water carrier. His behavior was a constant source of discord. It was like a single, sour, out-of-tune instrument in a beautiful orchestra, its jarring notes disrupting the harmony of the entire community. The other monks, practicing patience and compassion, endured his arrogance for a long time. They tried to reason with him, to gently correct him, but their words were like water on a stone. He was impenetrable, locked in the fortress of his own ego. Time and time again, he would be brought before the Buddha. "Channa," the Buddha would say with infinite patience, "in this Sangha, there is no high or low. We are like the rivers that flow into the great ocean. Once they merge, they lose their individual names and identities and become simply the ocean. Here there is no Sakyan prince, no Brahmin scholar, no outcast. We are all simply followers of the path. Sariputta and Moggallana are your guides and noble friends. Learn from them, respect them." Channa would prostrate himself, his lips mouthing words of agreement. "Yes, Blessed One, I understand." But as soon as he left the Buddha's presence, the old pride would reassert itself. He simply could not let go of the past. The identity of the prince's charioteer was the very bedrock of his being. To let it go would be for him a kind of death. He was more attached to his memory of the prince than he was to the living presence of the Buddha. Let yourself feel, for a moment, the pain of being so stuck.
The feeling of being trapped in an old story, unable to move forward, even when the path is right in front of you. It is a quiet and lonely kind of suffering. As the years wore on and the Buddha's life neared its end, this problem became more acute. Channa had made no spiritual progress whatsoever. While other monks who had been ordained long after him retaining the various stages of enlightenment, Channa remained mired in his pride and arrogance, his mind a turbulent sea of resentment. He was, as the other monks sadly noted, a difficult one to teach. Shortly before he passed into his final nirvana, the Buddha gave his last instructions to his cousin and faithful attendant, Ananda. Ananda, his heart already breaking with the sorrow of the Buddha's impending departure, asked, "Blessed One, after you are gone, what are we to do about the monk Channa? He is so stubborn, so difficult. He will not listen to anyone." The Buddha's final instruction regarding Channa was a stark and powerful act of spiritual medicine. "Ananda," he said, "after I am gone, the higher penalty is to be imposed on the monk Channa." This was the most severe form of social sanction within the monastic community. It was a complete and total ostracism. Ananda asked what this entailed. The Buddha explained, "Let the monk Channa say what he will, Ananda. The other monks are not to speak to him. They are not to exhort him. They are not to instruct him. He was to be rendered completely and utterly invisible. He was to be treated as if he did not exist.
It was a radical, seemingly harsh, but ultimately compassionate act. The Buddha knew that Channa's pride was fed by his interactions with others, by his ability to feel superior, to argue, to dismiss. His ego needed an audience. The only way to starve the ego was to take away its audience entirely, to plunge Channa into a profound and absolute social isolation, where the only person he would have to confront would be himself. After the Buddha's passing, when the entire world was plunged into grief, the great council of monks was held. Ananda, as he was instructed, tearfully announced the imposition of the higher penalty on Channa. When Channa heard the news, his world collapsed. He, Channa, the master's most loyal companion, the one who was there from the beginning, was to be shunned, ignored, treated as less than nothing by the very monks he had always despised. It was the ultimate humiliation, a blow to his pride so devastating that it shattered the very foundations of his identity. At first, he was filled with rage and indignation. He tried to speak to the other monks, to argue, to assert his status. But they followed the Buddha's instruction to the letter. They would walk past him as if he were a ghost. If he spoke, they would continue their conversations as if no sound had been made. If he sat down, they would move away. He tried to cling to his old identity. "I am Channa, the prince's charioteer," he would cry out. But his words echoed in a vacuum. No one responded. No one acknowledged him. No one even met his gaze. The grand fortress of his ego, which he had spent a lifetime building and defending, was being dismantled, brick by painful brick, by the sheer force of silence. Days turned into weeks. Channa was plunged into a loneliness more profound than any he had ever imagined. It was a suffocating, terrifying void. The silence of his brothers was a mirror, and in it, for the first time, he was forced to see himself, not as he imagined himself to be, but as he truly was, an arrogant, lonely, and deeply unhappy old man. The stories of his glorious past, which had been his constant companions, now sounded hollow and meaningless in the crushing silence. His pride, which had once felt like a suit of shining armor, now felt like a heavy, leaden cage, and he was its only prisoner. There was no one to blame, no one to argue with, no one to feel superior to. There was only himself and the deafening echo of his own suffering. The pain became unbearable. He was finally, completely and utterly broken. In the depths of his profound isolation, Channa wandered through the monastery like a specter. The other monks, in their silent, compassionate obedience to the Buddha's last command, continued their duties around him, their silence not one of malice, but of profound, radical therapy. The absence of interaction, of reaction, of any external validation forced Channa to turn his attention inward for the first time in his life. He had nowhere else to go. His mind, which had always been occupied with bolstering his ego and reliving his past, was now terrifyingly empty. And into that emptiness, the truth of his situation began to dawn. He saw his arrogance not as a sign of his special status, but as an ugly disease that had infected his heart. He saw his contempt for the other monks not as justified, but as the pathetic defense of a deeply insecure man. He saw his endless retelling of the past not as loyalty, but as a desperate refusal to accept the present. The silence of his brothers was not a punishment. It was a perfect, unblemished mirror, and the reflection he saw in it was unbearable. The pride he had nurtured for a lifetime was revealed to be nothing more than a source of immense, self-inflicted pain. He who had always believed himself to be closest to the master was, in fact, the furthest away. He had been in the presence of the sun, but had spent his whole life complaining about the shadows. This realization was so overwhelming, so devastating, that it brought him to his knees. In the solitude of his small, empty hut, Channa finally wept. He wept not for the prince he had lost, but for the man he had become. He wept for the wasted years, for the deafness of his heart, for the blindness of his pride. It was a storm of grief, shame, and remorse, so powerful that it washed away the foundations of his old self. The arrogant charioteer, the proud servant, the man who defined himself by a memory, that man died in the crucible of his own tears. When the storm passed, what was left was a quiet, humble, and broken old man. The weight of his pride had been lifted, and in its place was a vast, aching emptiness. But this was not the terrifying void of before. It was a peaceful emptiness, a fertile ground ready for a new seed. With a humility he had never before known, he understood what he had to do. He could not undo the past. He could not apologize to the monks, for they would not listen. There was only one path left, the path the Buddha had laid out for everyone, the path he had so long disdained. He began to practice. He sat in meditation, not with a mind full of his own importance, but with the simple, earnest intention to see the truth. At first, it was agonizing. His mind was a wild horse used to roaming the fields of arrogance and memory. But he persisted. He applied the teachings he had overheard for years but never truly listened to. He watched his thoughts come and go without attachment. He observed his feelings of shame and regret rise and fall like waves. He began for the first time to understand. He started to perform his monastic duties not with resentment, but with a quiet mindfulness. He swept the paths, not because he had to, but because it was an opportunity to practice attention. He focused on the feeling of the broom in his hands, the sound of the bristles on the dusty ground, the simple, rhythmic motion. The act of sweeping became a meditation. He fetched water, feeling the weight of the bucket, the coolness of the water on his hands. His world, which had been filled with the grand narrative of his past, now shrank to the beautiful, simple reality of the present moment. The other monks observed this change. They saw the haughtiness leave his posture. They saw the content in his eyes replaced by a quiet, sorrowful introspection. But they held to their vow of silence. His healing had to come from within, and it had to be complete. One day Channa was meditating on the nature of all conditioned things, how everything that arises is subject to passing away. He thought of his own life. He thought of the glorious Prince Siddhartha arising and then passing away. He thought of his own identity as the proud charioteer arising and now finally passing away. He saw his pride, his attachment, his arrogance, all as conditioned phenomena, impermanent, without any solid, lasting self. He saw it not as an intellectual concept, but as a deep, visceral truth. In that moment of profound insight, the final fetters of his ego broke. The illusion of a separate, special Channa dissolved completely. He had attained the state of an arhat, a fully enlightened being. He had finally, after a lifetime of resistance, reached the goal. He rose from his meditation a completely transformed being. The old, arrogant Channa was gone forever, replaced by a man filled with a deep, silent, and luminous peace. He went to find the venerable Ananda. Ananda saw him approaching, and for the first time since the Buddha's passing, he saw not the difficult, arrogant monk, but a being of profound tranquility. Channa bowed low before Ananda, a gesture of genuine, heartfelt humility. "Venerable Ananda," he said, his voice clear and calm, "I have followed the path. I have done the work. The Blessed One's final medicine has worked its cure. I ask that you now release me from the higher penalty, not for my sake, for I am content, but for the sake of the harmony of the Sangha." Ananda, his eyes filling with tears of joy, went before the assembly of monks and formally lifted the ban. The great silence was broken. Monks came to Channa not with words of chastisement, but with greetings of respect for a true brother on the path. He had finally joined the ocean. Channa lived out the rest of his days as a humble and beloved elder of the Sangha. He rarely spoke of his past life with the prince, not because it was painful, but because it no longer defined him. When new monks, hearing of his history, would ask him what it was like to be the great prince's charioteer, he would simply smile and say, "All that has passed. What matters is the path before us now." He had been the last person to be taught by the Buddha, and his lesson was the hardest of all. It was a lesson taught not with words, but with a profound, compassionate, and ultimately liberating silence. He had to lose the prince he was clinging to in order to find the Buddha who was waiting for him all along, not in the past, but in the timeless, peaceful truth of the present moment. This story is now complete. Let the peace of Channa's final transformation settle over you. His journey reminds us that it is never too late to let go, never too late to begin again. The past is a memory, and the future is a dream. Only in the quiet stillness of this present moment can we find true freedom. Rest now in that freedom. Rest in that peace. Allow yourself to drift into a deep, untroubled, and restorative sleep.